That may happen, but it's great to introduce Stefan to all of you. I think by now you probably all know each other, but Stefan has again been to the Summer Institute a couple of times, and this year is going from here directly up to the History of Economics Society annual meeting, which I think is one of the reasons that this week actually begins on Father's Day. And the Summer Institute began this week on Father's Day, so that people who travel from afar to come to the Summer Institute can then make their way up to the History of Economics Society. And I mention that because they were really quite generous this year in supporting the Summer Institute, the History of Economics Society. So it's good to have you here, and it'll be great as well to have you travel up to Syracuse and for the first time participate in that conference. Two very different sort of venues. We're going to learn about Hayek and Ordo-Liberalism, and Stefan, welcome.
Thank you, Sandy. It's great to be here again. I think the mic is working.
Yeah.
It's great to be here again. It's my third presentation at the Summer Institute. Yes, what I would like to present today is not precisely part of my dissertation, so I would like briefly to talk about the dissertation first, and then go into this particular paper which I would like to introduce. It's great that I talk after Eki, because we can build upon many things which we already heard. So I think this paper will be sort of a complement to what we just heard, so it really fits very well. So briefly, I would like to introduce my PhD project, which I was referring to the last lectures, and then I start delving into Hayek being, if it is legitimate to see Hayek as an Ordo-Liberal. I will briefly review his biographical relationships to OrdoLiberals to see that what I already mentioned with respect to Eucken, that there were some intensive relationships. And then for part 4, which is the main part of the talk, I would like to talk about Hayek in the 1930s and the 1940s, being, in my eyes, very close to the Ordo-Liberal paradigm. What I would like to do afterwards is, after reviewing the late Hayek, I would like to say something about Hayek and Mises, which I think can be seen from a different perspective if we bear in mind what I have said then before about Hayek probably having some Ordo-Liberal traces, and then I summarize. Concerning my project, which as I said, I introduced the last 2 years, is about this cube. So I'm looking at Röpke, Eucken, Hayek, and Mises. And I have 2 levels of analysis. The first level is the role of government in the economic order. The second level is more practical, or less abstract. It's about economic policy. So what I would like to stress upon today is that we will be moving on this first level. I will hardly be talking about practical economic policy. It will be more about general conceptions about what government should do within the economic order. So we're moving in this above half of the cube. The line is certainly not complete, because I started my analysis with Mises' habilitation from 1912, and the last book is Fatal Conceit, somewhere here, but it should give an impression that these are the authors in the time span which I would like to talk about. First, I presented Eucken and Hayek 2 years ago here. Last year it was Röpke and Eucken, and which I have not presented, but which I will briefly talk about today is Hayek and Mises. So what my overall goal of the project is to look at the myth of neoliberalism, which certainly, at least from my perspective today, is a global myth. And I would like to confront that myth with the German type of neoliberalism, which is Ordo-Liberalism. And that is also a very seminal part of what I would like to do today. I would like to show with this cube that there is a very significant span of policy proposals and of conceptions of government which are within neoliberalism. So, going to what you previously mentioned, that we should not look at neoliberalism as though it was something homogeneous, monolithic. That is actually one of my core intentions, to show that the different authors might come to similar proposals, but they come from very different directions. Which I would signify with this word topo, so this is the topo. And what I would like to do overall, what I'm doing in the project, is to track the evolution of these 4 authors individually, but especially certainly in comparison to each other. So that's what I would like to go for. And concerning today's paper and overall the dissertation project, it's in line of Ecke's advisor, Dr. Hamburg, and other people who work at the Röpke Institute. So it has not come into being out of vacuum, but it's, I would like to see myself in the tradition of these authors who have already said many things about the authors. However, I hope to be able to contribute something to this discourse, at least in Germany. Okay, so the question is, what is Ordo-Liberalism? We heard in Ecke's presentation the conception that Ordo-Liberalism is certainly closely related to Wilhelm Eucken, but the question which I would like to pose is, which is commonly posed in literature, if Ordo-Liberalism is to be restricted to Eucken and the Freiburg school. Interestingly, Ordo-Liberalism was not a term invented by Eucken himself or by the Freiburg school. It was a name which was proposed by a today at least fairly well-known economist called Hermann Müller in 1950. He said, we have a new type of liberalism in Germany which I would like to propose to be called Ordo-Liberalism. And in this definition in 1950, he said, Ordo-Liberalism in my eyes includes the work of Eucken certainly, but also Röpke, Hayek, and others. Okay, so that is, if we argue by having a classical definition, that's the classical definition, and it entails at least two questions. The first question is Hayek as an Ordo-Liberal. That's what I would like to talk about today. The second question is less relevant for today's talk. The question is, who is others? So who are the other authors which belong to Ordo-Liberalism? And it could be that it is the founding father of the term social market economy, which is someone in Germany who is a Cologne economist called Alfred Müller-Achmar. And overall, I propose this picture concerning the relationship between neoliberalism and Ordo-Liberalism. The solid line, so this solid black line, I would suggest is the border of Ordo-Liberalism. But unlike what we heard in Ecke's presentation, I would say that it's the Freiburg school is certainly the core of Ordo-Liberalism, but there are some Ordo-Liberals who do not directly pertain to the Freiburg school, like Röpke and Rousseau, who I still would like to see as Ordo-Liberals. And there are some neoliberals in Germany, like Müller-Achmar, who, there is a certain consensus on that, is not to be a part of this Ordo-Liberal school. So what I would like to stress upon the following is that they understand Ordo-Liberalism, broadly speaking, in the words of Eucken and Röpke. Okay, so I hope now to know what Ordo-Liberalism is. Concerning the persons involved, I have a brief sketch on what is the seminal content of this paradigm, because being in an Anglo-Saxon country, I cannot presuppose that. Of course, we've heard a lot about these things in Wiki, so I'll be fairly brief on that, but I thought it might be good to have a condensed presentation about what it is about. So there is a very seminal dichotomy in Ordo-Liberalism, which we have to bear in mind. The paradigm, or the dichotomy, is that we have the economic order, which is the framework or the rules of the game, and we have the economic process, which are the moves of the game. And this, in the eyes of Ordo-Liberals, unlike, by the way, in the eyes of Mises, can be separated. So we can separate the analysis of the economic order from the analysis of the economic process. And getting out of this, or starting from this initial dichotomy, we can define two types of policy. The first type of policy is what it's difficult to translate, so I took the very direct translation. In German it's Ordnungspolitik, in English I've translated it into policy of order. And then we have a policy of process. Policy of process is to be largely discarded, so this is interventionism. Policy of order, however, is seminal. Okay, so, and policy of order means that we saw the principles in Ecke's picture with the circle and the constitutive and the regulated principles. In Eucken's and in Röpke's work, this is the core part of economic policy. So economic policy should be about enhancing competition. What is also very important with respect to Hayek, and of course of the presentation, is that the framework, so the rules of the game, are designable. Okay? It may be that these rules, as Eucken formulates them, are discovered in a historical process in the course of, let's say, the evolution of legal science and economic science. But the framework is designable. It is not a spontaneous product of evolution. And it may be designed, for example, by government, but it's not only government which is involved. Professor Wagner was posing the question, is it wishful thinking? Oyken would say, if we have a specific type of government, a specific type of science, interestingly specific type of churches, then we can get to this, to a designable framework, and we can implement it with the force of this, with these elements. We have an interdependence of orders, which means that the separate orders, the legal order, the economic order, the political order, the cultural order, are all related to each other. So the economic order is certainly the focus of Ordo-Liberalism, but its relationships, especially to the legal and the political order, are of seminal importance. And if it comes to the normative solution of this quest for orders, as Oyken puts it, the overall solution is the competitive order, which is the order where principles I presented are implemented. So this is what the economy should go for. So that's what this government and the surrounding characters should go for. By the way, in Röpke, there is an interesting definition about how we come to this type of government. Röpke is, in my eyes, closer to a view of civil society, because he says we should involve universities, we should involve the press, we should involve what he calls the nobilitas naturalis, so many agents which are to counterbalance government in this quest for order. So it's not only about having government and having wishful thinking about how government should look like, but especially in Röpke, it is a program for how we surround government with specific civil society institutions which can counterbalance the potential problems coming out of government. What I talked about last year was about the significant differences between Oyken and Röpke. I would want to stress upon that. So, in the following, I understand Ordo-Liberalism as a conception which is based on these seminal principles, not bearing in mind the differences between the different authors. Okay, the question is, how does Hayek fit in? That's what the paper is about. And first, I would like to show that there were some interesting biographical relationships between Hayek and these two Ordo-Liberals I would like to talk about Oyken and Röpke. So they met, I said Oyken, it's not quite clear when they met, I don't know what your perception of that is, but Hayek writes it was via Röpke that he met Oyken, but he doesn't date the statement. However, Oyken and Hayek give each a paper to the conference of the German Economic Association in Zurich, 1928, so I guess that at least from 1928 on they knew each other. And interestingly, Hayek says in his interviews, memoirs, that on his way from London to Vienna and back, he was very often doing stopovers in Freiburg, which is about in the middle of this trip, and he was attending seminars, small conferences instituted by the Oyken Circle, as he calls it. So there is this relationship from the 1930s on. Certainly during the war it was very difficult to communicate. Röpke was more or less the hub between them. 1947, Oyken, as we heard, was a founding member of the Nobel Society. 1948, interestingly, Hayek was one of the founding editors, at least one of the founders of the Ordo book, which he quoted here. So that is interesting because it probably is one of the components how this guy Hermann Müller says that Hayek is part of Ordo-Liberalism. So until 1991, if you look at the cover of the Ordo magazine, it's Hayek being involved in the process. Of course, I don't know how actively he was involved, but at least nominally he was part of the journey. And when Hayek comes to Freiburg, 1962, also in his inaugural lecture, talking about coming to Freiburg from Chicago, he says that the unforgettable Walter Oyken is the person who he would like to see as his predecessor in Freiburg. And from 1962 onwards, Hayek is fairly active in the Walter Röpke Institute as president, as honorary president and all that. The relationship to Röpke is, in my eyes, even more intensive than to Eucken. They must have met in the beginning of the 20s, at the latest at 1926, and around the Great Depression, they had fairly intensive correspondence because Röpke had a specific answer to the Great Depression with his theory of the secondary depression, and there must have been, and there have been, intense discussions between Vienna on the one hand side and Röpke on the other hand side, which is honored by Habermas, for example, in some interviews which he's giving. So in the 30s, beginning of the 1930s, there was this relationship. Then Röpke has to emigrate to Turkey first and then to Geneva. 1937, when also Mises is in Geneva, Hayek gives a lecture at the HEI, and the correspondence, of course, continues because Röpke is in Switzerland. And interestingly, Röpke's wife translates the Ordo-Liberal into German, 1945. 1947, as we know, they both co-found the Montpellier Society. There is this falling apart in the end of the 50s called the Hunold affair in MTS, but what I think is interesting is that at Röpke's 80th anniversary, 1979, Hayek works as a co-editor of some selected works of Röpke. So I see that as a sign of late conciliation for with respect to Röpke, because he is Röpke died fairly soon after this Hunold affair, so it might be some aspect of feeling sorry on the part of Hayek that these things came into being in a Montpellier society. So as we see from this slide, there were intense relationships between the three guys, and I would like to pose now the question: can we learn from these relationships something about specific works of Hayek? So the convention separation, as we know it, of course, and I don't have to repeat it in this circle, is that Hayek can be seen as Hayek 1 versus Hayek 2. Hayek 1 being the business cycle theorist, and Hayek 2 being the social philosopher. That is certainly standard. In my opinion, this separation is admissible because there is the break about 1940, ending with the pure theory of capital, where he does leave business cycle theory to a large extent. However, and that is one of the seminal hypotheses in what I would like to say in the following, this separation seems to me inadequate. What I would like to argue for is that Hayek 2 is not a homogeneous phase, calling him the social philosopher. What I would like to go for is to say Hayek 2 is the Ordo-Liberal social philosopher from, let's say, 1935 until 1950, and Hayek 3 is the evolutionist social philosopher. So what I would like to propose is a threefold separation of Hayek, which is, in my eyes, and that's what I would like to show in the paper, more adequate than a twofold separation. And I would like to start with a quote. It's a quote from a foreword of the Roto-Serfdom edition of 1976 about the original edition. And he says, he begs for pardon that there is a fault. So Russia was our wartime ally, and then the italics are mine, and I could not free myself in 1944 from all current interventionist superstitions. Okay, and in consequence, I still made some concessions which I now think unwarranted. This is, I think, a very interesting quote, because the question is, who is the addressee of this statement? One answer could be that it's his teacher, Friedrich von Wieser, who was a mild social democrat in Vienna, but it could also be that current interventionist superstitions are Ordo-Liberalism, looking back at 1944. Because at another place, Hayek says about Ordo-Liberalism, by the way, excluding Eucken, that it seems to him from the perspective of the 1970s and 1980s as a sort of restrained liberalism. So it could be that Hayek, looking from the 70s to the 40s, means by current intervention superstitions precisely Ordo-Liberalism. Maybe it's his own liberalism. So I think from this quote we can see that also he himself sees him not as a monolithic social philosopher starting in 1935 and going back to the 70s, but it is obviously there is something within this social philosopher phase which seems of interest. I have two chapters concerning this Ordo-Liberal phase. The first chapter is about the 1930s, and the second chapter is about the 1940s. So what I would like to stress now is that in the 1930s there are some interesting initial traces, what I call germs, I don't know if it's the precise term in English, but there are some initial traces of being related to this Ordo-Liberal paradigm. And I have, in the first phase, in the 1930s, I would like to briefly analyze two texts. The one is the certainly well-known editorship concerning the socialist calculation debates. The other is a fairly unknown brochure, as far as I can judge that, which he published in 1939 in Chicago. So what was Hayek doing in these years? Of course, we know about the Keynes controversy, we know about the socialist calculation debates, but also in 1936, 37, 38, there were some interesting evolutions within his concept, and it was first of all economics of knowledge, where the knowledge topos becomes explicit, where he emancipates himself from standard general equilibrium theory and also from Mises. In 1938, we have the Kolev which was also addressed in the presentation before. So it is Hayek's years of high theory to the end of the 1930s seem really interesting because he's involved in so many controversies that there seem to happen many things within his conception. Okay, so let's look at these two texts, the editorship and the freedom and the economic system. If you look at the critique which the editorship got by Maurice Dobb, he says it's a formidable counterattack by laissez-faire on all forms of planning and in particular on socialism. However, if you read Hayek's contributions to this editorship, there are at least two questions which come up. The first question is it a critique from laissez-faire? And the second question is it a critique on all forms of planning, as Dobb puts it? And I would say it's neither. It's neither a laissez-faire position which Hayek goes for, nor does he attack all forms of planning. And that is a quote from one of the essays in the volume by Hayek. And he says, I wouldn't read the whole quotes, but he says, it is not laissez-faire or complete laissez-faire in the old sense, which we should actually support and advocate, being individualist liberals. So, and by the way, there is no reason to assume that the historically given institutions are necessarily the most natural in any sense. So there is Hayek, in this sense, cannot be seen, at least 1935, as an advocate of laissez-faire. So this contention of Dobb is certainly not correct. Another quote from the same essay, which is even more important because it contains some positive program. So we need the most appropriate permanent framework to secure, and this is also important concerning Ordo-Liberalism, the smoothest and most efficient working of competition. Bearing in mind what I said before about Ordo-Liberalism as an idea of framework and or policy of order enhancing competition, that I think is highly interesting. And this importance of the framework enhancing competition has been sadly neglected by economists before. So I think what we can learn from these quotes is a twofold conclusion. The first part of the conclusion is, yes, there is a necessity for a framework, for rules of the game, and we can go for designable rules of the game, as we will see also in the later quotes. So the framework is necessary and designable, and it is a neoliberalism which I have to go for, because this aspect of having a framework circumventing the economy, the economic process, has been sadly neglected by previous economists. Okay. This as I said before, a fairly unknown brochure, Freedom in the Economic System, 1939, is also highly interesting because in 1935, these are very brief passages. 1939, however, in Freedom in the Economic System, this thing can be seen as a manifesto, in my opinion, as Hayek as a social philosopher. And that's also how Dickinson sees it. He says it's a manifesto of individualistic liberalism, and it's a fundamental challenge to the doctrine of liberal socialism. What Dickinson primarily criticizes, is that there is a necessity for a positive program, which in his eyes Hayek does not deliver in this paper. So he says Hayek criticizes market socialism, but what is the positive issue Hayek goes for? And if we look at the brochure, in my opinion, it becomes quite apparent what Hayek proposes as a positive program. And this is a highly interesting quote, in my opinion, because he says, we can plan a system of general rules, equally applicable, we know that from the late Hayek, of course, which provides the institutional framework within which the decisions, how the individuals earn a living, are left to the individuals. That is OrdoLiberalism, in my eyes. So he can plan the system of rules. And this is the institutional framework which leaves decisions to the individuals. That is, in my opinion, a very concise form of Hayek's Ordo-Liberal third wave of the 1930s. Progressing to the 1940s. In the 1940s, I would say that after the years of high theory, 1930s, the highly political years in Hayek come up. What is happening at that time, he's living economics proper, as we saw, so Hayek 1 is over. He's writing the Ordo-Liberal in 1944, and he founds the Federal Society. And I see the 1940s as the climax of Hayek's Ordo-Liberalism. And I would like to, again, review two texts, as in the 30s. The first text is the Ordo-Liberal, and the second text is the contribution which Hayek gives to the first meeting of the Federal Society. If we have a look at the Ordo-Liberal, I think it's very clear that the central idea of Ordo-Liberalism, interdependence of orders, is at the core of the book. The relationship between political liberty, or political order, and economic liberty, I think can well be attributed to the idea of the interdependence of orders. So the idea that freedom is not separable, that we cannot go for a politically free but economically unfree system, I think that is at the core of the interdependence of orders. And the framework, which we already saw in the 1930s, is still present. I would say it's even more explicit than it was in the 1930s. I would like to stress this word, design. I think looking at Hayek as we know him from his later publications, it's really amazing that he uses the word design. So at this time, the framework is not only necessary, but it is explicitly designable. And it must be a most rational framework which is to be designed by economists or by whoever, but it is designable. So I think that's very interesting. In another quote, which I don't have on the slides, he's talking about constructing the framework. So the framework is something which he probably later criticizes with his rationalistic constructivism. Another quote, the liberal argument does not deny but even emphasizes that competition needs a carefully thought out legal framework. Again, the designability issue is included. And the past legal rules are not free from grave defects. Again, a twofold conclusion. Again, we need a framework. And there is an interesting skepticism towards grown solutions, which certainly will withdraw in the late Hayek. But it's really interesting that at this point, and that's one of my core arguments, he goes for a framework and he goes for a rationally designable framework. There is interesting correspondence with Eucken and with Keynes concerning the Ordo-Liberal. There is a letter from Eucken to Hayek, where Eucken is very positive on the road to serfdom, but he would like Hayek to be more explicit. He says, it contains the right ideas, but I would like you to be more explicit on the term competitive order, because that's what we from Freiburg see as the solution, and we don't have that as explicit in the road to serfdom. But overall, he's very positive. Keynes is also fairly positive, but he says, you know, these general rules which you're talking about, the framework, that doesn't give us the border for the role of government. So that is a sort of an empty conception. So he misses precisely this Ordo-Liberal type of delineating government and says that is empty, or at least it doesn't show us the line where to stop. Okay. So much for the road to serfdom. I have a very long quote. I apologize for that, but it's really one sentence, so I couldn't cut it. And this is the second text from the 1940s, which I'm looking at. This is this address to the Montpellier Society at the founding meeting. And again here, which by the way, and that's why I put it in italics, it's competitive order. So Eucken writes 46 to Hayek, please use the word competitive order. And 47, Hayek does that at the founding meeting of the Montpellier Society. So the Freiburg type of normative aim is explicitly there. And again, we are going for a legal framework which makes competition as effective, as beneficial as possible. Okay. So we have these 1930 papers, 1940 papers, and in my opinion, this can be seen as absolutely analogous to what is parallelly done at this time in Freiburg, as we saw before, not only in Freiburg, but also in Chicago. In my paper, I would like first to see it as a result of the relationship to Eucken and Röpke. In part 5, as I said, I would like to have a look at Hayek 3, so the Hayek which we better know than Hayek 2, and pose the question if Ordo-Liberalism dies out in the 1940s, or does it live on in some aspects of the evolutionist Hayek? Okay. In one of his last papers, Samuelson said Hayek was an extremist. Okay. There is a an Austrian economist called Erich Geisler who, in the 70s, tries to very much contrast Hayek to Freiburg. So my question is, what happened? Bearing in mind what we just saw, that cannot be, because Ordo-Liberalism is not extremism. And bearing in mind what we read about the framework in the 1930s and 1940s, you cannot contrast this Hayek to Freiburg. So the question is, what happened? Certainly what happened is the theory of cultural evolution and the spontaneous order idea, and that leads Hayek to deviate from these early positions of Ordo-Liberalism. I have very tentative hypotheses concerning the source of this diversion, so what made him distance himself from the current interventionist superstitions of the 1930s and 40s. And certainly, on the one hand side, it is his increasing involvement in the Scottish philosophy, Hume Smith Ferguson, which doesn't play such a seminal part in Eucken. And in my view, it's also the sensory order where he becomes skeptical about human cognition and about the necessities, implicitly, which a designable framework poses to human cognition. So, bearing in mind the sensory order, you have to be skeptical about the designability of rules. And this is probably what happened. But these are, as I said, just tentative hypotheses. However, of course, the role of rules remains in Hayek. Constructing the PhD, in the thesis I see it, there is the evolution between Hayek 2 and Hayek 3, in my eyes, can be seen in his analogy what government should do. In the Road to Serfdom, he says government is the umpire, so the judge, and the framework which is put by this judge leaves room for individuals, so Ordo-Liberal. In the 1960s, he's using this very famous analogy of the gardener. So government is not the judge, it's a gardener. I think it's a gardener of an English garden, not of a French garden. So it's a very spontaneous garden, not designed and geometrically constructed. So I think this is an interesting evolution because still the gardener is in control of some aspects of the system, but he's not the judge, he's not the umpire who is in total control of the system. And that's why I see the core difference between Hayek 2 and Hayek 3 in this seminal issue concerning the designability of the framework. As we saw in the early text, it's designable. As we know from the late texts, rules are a product of evolution. By the way, in my opinion, a very similar story to what Professor Buchanan told us yesterday about Chicago. So we can say that the evolution which Buchanan sees in Chicago is precisely the same as the evolution within Hayek himself. And the knowledge topos, which is certainly the core of Hayek, at least in my eyes, is present in Hayek 1, in the sense of relative prices being the core of his business cycle theory. It becomes explicit in Hayek 2, in economics of knowledge and the use of knowledge in society, but in Hayek 3 it's only present. We have prices as the collectors of short-term economic knowledge and rules as the collectors of evolutionary long-term knowledge. So the framework is no longer designable, but the necessity for a framework is still there in Hayek 3 just as it is in Hayek 2. I would say in his most evolutionist idea, the denationalization, there is an interesting quote where he says that, again, we need to provide a legal framework of legal rules within which people can develop the monetary institutions which are best suited them. I would say, of course, the denationalization cannot be seen as a sort of issue. It's a very evolutionist concept. But in my opinion, even in this phase, bearing in mind such quotations, he's not too far away from Ordo-Liberalism. Okay. My pre-last part is, what is the corollary of that regarding Hayek and Mises? And I think that these spectacles, which I put looking at Hayek from an Ordo-Liberal perspective, bears an interesting conclusion regarding the relationship, or as Hayek puts it, the curious relationship between himself and Mises. There is, of course, this extensive literature on dehomogenization of Hayek and Mises, and I do believe, however, from a different perspective, that a dehomogenization is necessary. But the present state of the debate, which is not as active as it used to be some years ago, is very much focused on the socialist calculation positions. However, I think that if we look at the role of government in the two authors, we can see something very interesting in certain comparison. And the comparison is that if we see Mises as a laissez-faire proponent, as he sees himself, and if we see Hayek as an Ordo-Liberal, then such a juxtaposition can be very helpful to understand this, in my view, fairly significant differences on the role of government between Hayek and Mises. Because rules, or the framework, as we saw it in the Ordo-Liberal Hayek in the 1930s and 40s, is, I wouldn't say absent in Mises, because if it was absent, he would be an anarchist. But it doesn't play at all this systematic role which it does in Hayek. So if you look at the role of rules for Hayek and Mises, and if we see Hayek in this respect as an Ordo-Liberal, that can help to circumvent two very important misunderstandings. One misunderstanding is that we can stop looking at Mises as a covert anarchist, and parallelly we can stop looking at Hayek as Röpke, thus looking at him as a covert social democrat. So I think looking at Mises as a proponent of laissez-faire versus Hayek being a proponent of Ordo-Liberalism can help us solve these interpretative misunderstandings, which are, in my opinion, very deplorable. So that is what I would like to get from this paper concerning tactics and interpretation of different authors, with different spectacles. I would like to summarize. Certainly Hayek is a very complex personality. He lived long and he had manifold twists, as I call it here, in his vita. But I really would like to stress that a threefold separation, as I proposed it in the paper, is helpful in looking, is certainly superior to a twofold framework, because if we do not look at this ordo-liberal phase of the 1930s and 1940s, then the Freiburg connection disappears. And I love Bruce Caldwell's book on Hayek's challenge, but if you look Eucken and Freiburg, you hardly find anything. So if you stick to the twofold separation, the business cycle theorist and the homogeneous social philosopher, then in my opinion you miss something very important, which I would like to stress by this threefold separation. As I hope to have shown in the 1930s and 1940s, the ordo-liberal stance concerning the necessity of a designable framework is omnipresent, so that should not be overlooked. Hayek, if we see him with this ordo-liberal perspective, does not have to be seen as a Darwinian, Darwinist, or as an extremist. And in addition, I hope we have briefly shown, which is more explicit in the paper, that the Hayek-Mises relationship gains from such a perspective on Hayek, because it can help us to hold them apart regarding some controversial issues to their respective role of government. What I would like to do next is to have a more detailed look at the reasons for the divergence from Freiburg. So what I stressed before was the Scottish involvement in Scottish philosophy and the sensory order. That's what I would like to more precisely focus on. And certainly I just had one simple, fairly simple pattern which I tried to explain. That was the relationship between Freiburg and Hayek, or between Ordo-Liberalism of Eucken and Röpke to Hayek. The story is certainly more complex. The story entails London. It might entail Paris. That's what I was told recently at a presentation of this paper, that I should bear in mind that the French liberals and the colloquial were not fairly different from what is here. So it must not be seen as a uniform, unidirectional relationship between Ordo-Liberalism and Hayek. And we saw in Hayek's paper that, of course, it bears, we can gain from that, we can gain something if we also include Chicago. So the relationship is certainly manifold, but I think with this paper I can stress on one specific strand in the argumentation concerning Hayek and Ordo-Liberalism. There is an interesting quote by a fairly well-known in Germany professor who says, in the course of the financial crisis, helpful to Ecke for his quotation, he says, Eucken must finally come to America, because if Eucken does not come to America, then we are in the hands of the new Chicago school, and we need to be, in Professor Buchanan's terms, we need to be in the hands of the old Chicago school. So Eucken needs to come to America. That was a recent quote. We saw this picture already, Eucken sitting over there, and my proposal of the paper is that if Hayek too joins Eucken, that might be even more.
Who do we have with questions and comments? Okay, I'm going to start with Marina. She's far away.
I really appreciate your presentation, and I like the distinction between Hayek 2 and Hayek 3. This is a very tangential support of what you're saying, and it may not even be, besides tangential, might not even be relevant. But a great admirer of Hayek is Vernon Smith. In one of his last books, I don't know if it's the last one, but it's one of the most recent books, it's called The Two Views of Rationalities, Constructivist Rationality and Ecological Rationality. And what it describes is these differences in rationality which parallels, in a very strict way, what you're describing about Hayek. And he is explicit in recognizing Hayek as a source of, let's call it inspiration for his work. So in a sense, that would make your argument much stronger, but these are very indirect support.
No, helpful for the comments. Perhaps you can give me the quote.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I wonder in terms of this distinction between emphasis upon design orders in Hayek 2 and emergent orders in Hayek 3, if instead of portraying this, perhaps it's may not be your attention, as a deviation away from the Ordo program, and could it not be portrayed as an extension, a development, an amplification, an improvement, whatever kind of term you want, in the sense of learning new things within the same animating framework? That I'm thinking, for instance, an example of Thomas Schiller in this book, probably in the late 70s, Micromotives and Macro Behavior, or Reverse it, whichever, that it was a series of examples of illustrations of people in an evolutionary context, people following certain kinds of rules of conduct and generating outcomes that reasonably the participants wouldn't have liked. And you can think of people coming to a position of saying, well, yeah, things aren't the way we like it, how can we fix it? But what you get from Schelling is that fixing has to be done in a way that is still consistent with the deep down sort of motivational concerns of the participants, and which is well, you change the rules and you're going to, so that you go from rules to outcomes, it's still there. But when we get to these constitutional matters, there is a place then for explicit formalized rules. You can have rules that, the American Constitution has rules that states can't take property without the consent and just compensation for public purpose. Now, what that really means is a whole different matter, because you get into the realm of interpretation, and that interpretation is something that, there's nothing out there that tells what a taking for a public purpose is, independently of the process by which a taking is either taken or it's rejected. And so sentiments change, understanding changing, as part of the context of Canada Afraid to Be Free was kind of a, what he was tracing out in that paper was kind of a drift in the realm of sentiment, in which people, he felt, were in significant measures losing, and some of them will, to conduct their own lives. And so that can be an emergent quality in the Hayekian 3 sense. But then if you don't like that, and you probably wouldn't, then there's questions, how can you address that in some kind of constructive sense? And so I can see sort of not a kind of deviation of 2 from 3 away from the Ordo program, but rather a strengthening of it through a recognition that it's not, you design rules once and for all and life goes on within those rules, but rather that's the formal set. There's also this whole informal kinds of processes that go on that may take things in directions that are contrary where people might really like to have things go. And so then there's a second stage that we have to think, well, how can we get back or things like that. So that's why I wonder whether you might think of it not, 2 and 3 isn't like changing from one model car to another, but rather the equivalent of the same car being come out, but it goes faster, it has built-in GPS systems, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would not say that Hayek 2 and Hayek 3 are dichotomous. I do, as I hope to show, the role of rules is still involved. And I agree with you that that some rules might be to be set, and some rules might to be found in the process of culture. I also, in this point, I slightly deviate from Professor Hamburg, because he's supporting, when he compares Buchanan and Hayek in this paper of the late 70s, early 80s, he is going for a proposal which is close to what you just said. I'm slightly more, I tend to see this separation not as dichotomous, but as something which is, because if the framework is designable or not, seems to me an important distinction from, and as we saw, he's saying it must be thought out, it must be designed, it must be constructed, which from what he certainly deviates afterwards. But I think your comment is helpful because you said that, I like this picture of the car which you said in the last sentence. It could be that Hayek, with his concept of cultural evolution, contributes to Ordo-Liberalism in the sense that he provides a theory how the framework evolves, which in Hayek and Röpke is to some extent exogenous. So we lead a framework and I post up some principles, and this is the framework, but and Hayek says, yes, these principles have been found, they're not designed on a blackboard, but nevertheless it's not endogenized how the rules, how the framework came up. So I'm going back and forth between that. I have to think about it in more detail, but currently I tend to see it as an important distinction, and I would be curious where Maria is to see also the Bernard Smith point on that.
I have two questions. The first one is the historiographical point of using autobiographical notes. So a number of times in your presentation and also in the paper you use quotes by, for instance, Hayek to show his opinion of Walter Eucken 3 decades earlier. And that may, of course, be a very good assessment of his opinion 3 decades earlier. But then I think you at least need to show why this is a good assessment, because autobiographical notes, in my opinion, are always to be at least mistrusted, or at least to be explicitly proven correct before taken into account. And the second point is a question. So you let the Hayek 3 start in 1950, and roughly, and of course Century Order 1952 is a major source, a major book in the Hayek 3, but I'm not an expert on Hayek like you, of course, but if I remember correctly, the Century Order was written, or at least based on notes taken in the 1920s on the Gestalt psychology. So I was wondering how you square this with your timeline.
Concerning your first question, I agree with you that old men, when they're 70, 80, might be not very objective of what they said. I use this quote about the current interventionist superstitions as a hypothesis, so I don't take it for granted that he sees himself as an interventionist in the 40s, but I think it's an interesting first glance at the problem. So, but I'm grateful for the comment, because there was this quote which I also used saying that he says that the Eucken circle, except Eucken, was a group of restrained liberalism, which of course is strange because some 10 years before he said that in the interview, he was so laudable of the Freiburg school. So I agree on that, but I hope to have used that only as a very tentative hypothesis and not as a real claim that this is because Hayek says in the 1970s. It was just a first glance. Concerning the sensory order, I agree that certainly his interest in neurobiology or biology itself was as old as in the 1920s. And I know that some ideas of the sensory order were put out in these early young essays of the 1920s, but I think that if the sensory order comes up on top of what we saw in the 1930s and 40s, it might, so in the 1920s you certainly had no idea about frameworks and rules and all that, so I think the combination of the idea of the framework seen in the 30s and 40s, and then sensory order coming on top, might lead you to this different perspective on rules which then comes up. So I think it's the combination of what I call the Ordo-Liberal phase and the century order which leads to a more evolutionist argument. But I agree with you that the century order was not written between 1950 and 1952. I just wanted to say that I see the end as, or at least the text, the last text which I used was this address to the Montpellier Society. So I would say the end of the 40s, there seems to be happening something, a tentative hypothesis with that would be Scottish philosophy and century order.
I have only 2 comments. The first one reason for Hayek to deviate from the Ordo guys was, as you put it, the increasing involvement in the Scottish philosophy on Ordo human Smith. And this is exactly the issue that Racine Selly identifies in the book Classical Liberalism and International Economic Order to be at the center of the interest of the Ordo guys and of the Chicago School. This is only one comment. The second was the Constructivism. There, I think he was cleaning together with Mises. I read that, it was too bad that we didn't talk about it earlier. But I think there are some controversies. I think, so maybe some here in the room have been attending that seminar at Liberty Fund or something, in which this becomes apparent that Hayek here takes stands shoulder to Mises and denying that there must be a third way to be found. Actually, I'm not 100% sure on that. I mean, I've read that in French, but when I knew about these issues, discussed by Michael Goldman, for examples,
Sorry, I haven't read his book recently. It's long ago that I read it, and I found his view on Röpke very helpful, but I have to look it up again. Manuel Wörster, which we both know, gave me his recent paper on Smith from an Ordo-Liberal perspective, and there he says that it's curious that Eucken is so positive on Kant and so negligent and negative on Smith, which I think, and I looked it up, the Smith quotes in the Principles, it's really not too positive. So I think there is a difference in Hayek's perception of the Scots and the Ordo-Liberal perception of the Scots. I would say there is a difference, but I have to look up Racine Selly again. I read it in the beginning of my thesis, and I have to look it up. Concerning the Colloquialism, my French is too poor, but I heard Michael told me that it's not translated into English, so I should read the compte rendu about the talks. So it would be interesting to see what Hayek's position there would be. I haven't read it yet because of my French,
but it was translated.
Yes, I know, but I haven't read the translation yet, so I should look that up.
But this was an argument by Garvey, I think, with Maurice Allais, with Paris, while you put Paris inside it.
Yes, it was Garvey, yes.
So, I find your paper very interesting. I have some comments to make first on OrdoLiberalism, then on Hayek. I know that your goal in this paper is not to say that Hayek and German OrdoLiberalism are perfectly identical. There can be some differences between the two theories, and I think that one difference is particularly interesting. The different position of Hayek and OrdoLiberalism on monopoly. I know that OrdoLiberalism advocates antitrust law, which is not the case of Hayek, who say that monopoly is legitimate as long as there is free entry. This is the first comment. And the second concerns Hayek, the distinction between Hayek 2 and Hayek 3. You're right that Hayek uses the term construction of a rational framework, a term that he would certainly no more use later when he criticizes rationalistic constructivism. In my opinion, even later it is not a problem for Hayek to speak of the construction of a rational framework, because it is not constructivist. what is constructivist is the construction of an order of actions, of concrete predictions. On the other hand, the construction of an order of abstract rules or pattern predictions is not constructivism. And I don't know, but I think it is close to Richard Wagner's comment.
Should I answer that?
Go ahead.
I agree with you that that was my claim, or the goal of the paper is not to say that Hayek is an Ordo-Liberal of the Freiburg type. Actually, in the thesis I say, and this is not highly original because there is some literature on that Röpke, Eucken, and Hayek stay for different types of Ordo-Liberalism. Röpke being the sociologist Ordo-Liberalism, Eucken being the pure type of Ordo-Liberalism of the Freiburg stance, and Hayek being, in the sense of the evolutionist Ordo-Liberal. So he adds something to Ordo-Liberalism which is not in the other authors. So my claim was not to put him into the box of Freiburg and to close the box. He doesn't certainly fit in there perfectly. And I agree with you that the position on the competition policy is different. If you look back to the cube, I was moving on this area. Okay, in the second part of each comparison, which is the second area, and that was my first presentation 2 years ago. I'm very keen to focus the different perception. I think the different perception concerning competition policy comes from the different perception of competition, because already in Individualism and Economic Order, where he writes this essay, The Meaning of Competition, this is a very much more dynamic view of looking at competition than the Freiburg type. So that's where the difference on competition policy comes from. But I think it's not from the framework. So today I was looking at the first level, but I fully agree that on the second level there are significant differences. That's certainly true. And concerning constructivism, I would say that if you would design an encompassing system of rules, and you say this is the system of rules which I propose really on the blackboard, I would not agree that Hayek would say that it's not constructivism. We have to talk about that perhaps in detail, because socialism is such a system of rules. No? We can talk about that. That's interesting. I thought that if you design an interdependent system of rules, and if you propose this system of rules as an idea of your mind, which has not grown out of trial and error processes, but which is really your thought-out system of rules, that might be criticized by constructivism. But we can talk about that. It would be interesting.
Do you want to come back? We're back and forth about it.
So, well, my English is not good enough to make the comment in the details, but what I wanted to say is that, according to Hayek, socialism is constructivist because it is not made of abstract rules. It is concrete rules. It is comments, and not abstract rules. Whereas market economy is made of abstract rules. That is why it is not constructivist, I think. This is two different levels.
Yes, but even if we would consider a system as a rule of law, so a rule of law system with one content and a rule of law system with a different content, saying, if, for example, I told us about the importance of liability in Ordo-Liberalism. If we look at two different systems with two different contents concerning liability, different rules of liability, and if you propose something which is your idea, which hasn't been found by common law or something, I would say he would criticize that. So it's a general rule, it's one general rule opposing another general rule, but that would still be something which has not been tested, which is really rationalistic product of your own design concerning this general rule. But I suggest we talk about that. It's really interesting because
wine at dinner tonight. Just
No, that's great. That's great. It's plenty to talk about.
I didn't mean to cut the conversation off.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to this side. I know there's some questions over here, but this side of the room is getting short.
Yeah, I'm still just slightly trying to get a handle on Hayek 3. So two questions really. Firstly, obviously, Constitution of Liberty and your timing fits into Hayek 3. But of course, there's that, that at the end of the book, why I'm not a conservative, and that still seems to be quite a positive program of sort of liberalism, which I'm wondering if that isn't more ordo or not. So that's question one. Question two is just related to the notion of the spontaneous order, and is that something that gets, you would say, formed part of your narrative, that gets emphasised even more? So if you think about his denationalisation of money, I mean, that's obviously heavily about the sort of allowing free banking, allowing monetary order to spontaneously evolve. And yet at the same time, it's clearly much more radical, because it would allow, it actually argues for a very significant change in the way that money is arranged and organised in society, the monetary order, if you like. So, in a sense, would that be part of, is that kind of what you're talking about? It's almost a radicalism of the denationalisation ideas, which aren't ordo-liberal, or?
On that we have probably to involve Enki also, but let me first answer the first question first. Concerning the Constitution of Liberty, I think it's of course appears 1960, so chronologically it fits into Hayek 3, but and I would say more fits into Hayek 3, but if we look at the monetary issues in the Constitution of Liberty, there he says denationalization is a no-go, more or less. So there he says we need monetary rules, etc., etc. And afterwards, in the 70s, he goes to the denationalization. So the Constitution of Liberty, being a very complex book, I think contains also ordo-liberal traces. And if you look up, there is no quote of Röpke, but if you look up the acknowledgements in the back of the book, he says there are many people who have been seminal for his work, and it's of course Mises, Frank Nye, but also Röpke. So he's quoted in the list of people who are seminal for his work, and who, if he quotes them directly, would fill his quotation pages thoroughly. So I have to reread the Constitution of Liberty with this hypothesis. So I think it's a book which contains both elements. There are some evolutionist issues. His involvement in common law is certainly very strong in the Constitution of Liberty, which in this text you cannot find. So I have to reread it. I'm not sure. And concerning the spontaneous order, I would say that the spontaneous order is, it differs from the Freiburg type of order. So, of course, both is based on rules. But if the spontaneous order shapes also the rules and not only the process, it would not be a Freiburg type of order. In Freiburg, you say the rules are set by whoever, by the scientist who is advising the politician, or by the politician himself, but the rules are set. And the order which evolves within these rules should be competitive. But the idea of spontaneous order, I recently found something in Röpke in the 1930s talking about spontaneous orders in his economics textbook. So ahead of Hayek, but I would say, I don't know, Eki, how you see that, but I would say spontaneous order is not really the Freiburg type of order.
I was just happy that you posed that question, because once again, to just put it clear, you said, well, the denationalization of money is the best proof for a non-ordo-liberal type of monetary order. Absolutely. I mean, this is in the predominant perception exactly the case. But the thing is that the ordo-liberals came up with a scheme for a free banking system, which was overlooked. One of his most important pupils Leonard Mitchell was an academic advisor to Röpke, came up with such a free banking proposal in 1949, because he was of the opinion that the future Bundesbank needed to have such a stability mechanism of privately issued money. So this is exactly what I addressed to in my dissertation thesis, and this is what I'm an absolute fan of. So therefore, the Ordo-Liberals came up with a free banking proposal too. And the other issue is, and here I'd like to quote Eucken from 1923. This is even, before Rothbard and Mises and all the others came up with these ideas of free banking. I just quote that: to prevent the abuse of its authority on money supply, it behoves, so the state, to disable himself from defining the quantity of money and allow for currency competition. And this is all in 1923, so this is a big mistaken belief that the Ordo guys were all pro-central banking.
I have a question and a suggestion. Do you think that the passage between Hayek 3 and Hayek 2 and Hayek 3 is just a natural development, or what Hayek called true individualism? And also, maybe it could be useful to check which was the position of Hayek according to Mengel's thought, because you mentioned the influence of Scottish authors, and in that particular period, Hayek recognized in Mengel as a follower of the Scottish Enlightenment rather than of the German tradition. This position, in my opinion, is quite complicated, but maybe you can also check the position of Hayek on Mengel.
I didn't precisely understand what you mean by natural development.
The natural development of what Hayek called the true individualism. You know that according to Hayek, individualism can be true and false. So the false individualism is based on the Cartesian rationalism and so on constructivism. And using that model, you can build a sort of perfect planned model that you can apply to society, to individual life, and to politics and whatever. And it's very dangerous because it can lead to fascism, for example, because we have a perfect model based on a rational, not on any rational motivation. And then you can go in a very dangerous way. True individualism instead is based on the spontaneous order of the development of individual plants who had the knowledge is not perfect and whatever. So this was, so I at a certain point to try to understand which kind of knowledge people has, individual has. And that's why at the very end of his, this is my opinion, of his research on individualism, he go back to the sensory order that he wrote when he was very young, because the sensory order was its book on psychology, in order to explain how human minds work, individual human minds work, and also the society works. And then from individualism, so from methodological issue to psychology, and then to complex system, to rules, the role of rules. So I think that between Hayek 2 and Hayek 3, and this distinction exists, of course, there's not a break. It's a sort of natural development of what Hayek thought that individualism, true individualism is. I would like to know your opinion about that, because your paper starts with this distinction between Hayek 2 and Hayek 3, and I'm very interested about that. Thank you.
Yes, certainly I'm aware of the two individualisms, but the question is, do you have to follow this line of thought automatically? What I was saying as a hypothesis, and both individualism, true and false, and the meaning of competition are in this 1948 volume, Individualism and Economic Order. And also in true individualism, in individualism, true and false, he's very strong on the role of his cults. So, but I wouldn't. I'm a little bit. If we say it's a natural development, it seems to me a little bit deterministic that he had to come to these conclusions. I think he came to these conclusions because of particular involvements in specific strands of philosophy, and he did not have to come to the conclusions by way of necessity. So I think if he had not read as much of Scholz or Burke, he must not have come to these conclusions. But it might be that, again, just in the statement before, if you combine this program of the 40s with century order and the Scholz or of true individualism, it might be that you can come to these conclusions. But I don't know, I wouldn't call it a natural development because it has a taste of determinism, I would say. Concerning Menger, I think in 1926, I'm not sure about that, but I think he edited some works of Menger. So he was well aware of Menger, well before that. I mean, he didn't study under Menger, but he was certainly aware of him. I'm not very firm on the Menger-Hayek relationship. I mean, there is a quote of these questionable interviews which are discussing, where he says that he saw Menger just once, but it's certainly very important that the spontaneous order might have come also via Menger. It might have come directly from Smith to Hayek, or it might have come from Smith over Menger to Hayek. That's certainly possible.
I suggest you check Menger.
Yes, thank you.
That should be good.
We'll learn more about Menger later.
Yeah, I want to re-emphasize that question, and also Richard Wagner's point there. Can you see Hayek 3 as simply clarifying what Hayek 2 was all about? That is, Hayek 3 being a more mature, fully worked out perspective, Hayek 2, that the basis, what does, it's not, I would be surprised if Hayek gave up on the idea of rules and the necessity for rules, or the fact that individuals design these rules. Because Hayek 3 seems to be more an attempt to sort of expound on what he thought were the basic foundations for these rules, and more importantly perhaps the principles on which these rules were to be changed. So I see more of a continuity or a maturity issue rather than a break here between Hayek 2 and 3.
It could be. I will really bear in mind the car analogy. However, I mean, we're talking about a person who was 50 years old, so I don't think he has to mature anymore. So I think you can be fairly mature at 50. So
David Levy would be evidence to the contrary.
So I think again, as in the comment before about the natural development, that he thought out what was there. He might have come to different conclusions, I think. He might have said that, okay, rules are important, 1940s, 1950, we need a framework, but he might have come to a much more elitist view of how this framework is created. It must not have come to an anonymous process of evolution which is creating the framework. He might have come to a stance that it is the elite, the science and bureaucrats which design this framework. So I think it's interesting, and it's interesting that he obviously sees the knowledge problem in the framework, which is not yet present here. Okay, so at some point he says, I don't know if I found this quote, he says that, he says at some point that if our knowledge proceeds, we need to enhance the framework. He says it in one of the quotes I was showing, but I'm not sure if, I wouldn't say he thought out directly what was in these ideas. I think there was something in addition which comes into the spontaneous order conception, as contrasted to what I say, what I tried to show here. I'm not perfectly sure what it is, but I think it's not just thinking to the end what was in here in this early phase. I think something additional has come in because the deviation from Freiburg in this respect is significant. But I have probably this will be another paper to saying rereading the sensory order, looking back at the different perception of Hayek on Smith and the Scots rather than Ordo-Liberals. That would be certainly a follow-up. This is just a first idea, but I wouldn't say it's the direct continuation of these thoughts.
First, on respect to Hayek and Menger, Hayek brought out the collected works of Menger back in 35 or so.
Yeah, okay. And
that's reprinted by the Tübingen publisher. More. Question I wondered, in terms of Hayek, if you would, on hindsight, I think it'd come back now. I wonder whether you might think he might write a paper called The Mirage of Constructivism. To go along with Mirage of Social Justice. You look at his distinction into orders and organizations. You say that, would he not say that you can't really construct a society? You can construct organizations. Now it happens that some organizations may be very big as states, but I remember thinking, for instance, back in the 60s, Ray Roberts, he was very much influenced by Michael Polanyi, was a contemporary in my graduate school, put out a couple of papers with JPE and then a book that he issued called Alienation in the Soviet Economy. And the central point of that piece of work was the Soviet Union was never a constructed, hierarchically organized society. What it was a polycentric system that was terribly screwed up with horrible incentives in various ways. And that I wonder whether, in the same token, that there might actually be a mirage of constructivism, in the sense that all that can be built are organizations, some of which may be very big, but no organization is capable of totally controlling, like the Soviet Union did, Mao's China didn't, anything else. Hitler's Germany didn't either. There's life within that as well, and so I think, and I just wonder whether that might be the right topic that Hayek himself had thought about it, in terms of other categories of thought might have embraced.
Yeah, it's very interesting because my current project after the thesis is on the centrally planned economy. So I see it precisely in this way that we have an idea. Could be that it's also based on Hayek, that this was designed and society, but I also see the centrally planned economy as a fairly chaotic, as a structure which is really worth, I was not aware of these papers, but worth looking at from a public trust perspective, because the incentives were really highly interesting between the different ministries and the board of planning, etc. I think it's interesting to I always, or fairly often, pose questions, what would Hayek say? So in this respect, this is interesting to say that we cannot construct a society. But I would still say that in socialism, perhaps it was not well planned, but it did succeed in destroying a lot of things. So it was not a perfect construction, but imperfect as it was, it did destroy many rules, many formal and informal rules which were before there. So I would say that constructivism can certainly not be perfect, but it can well have some very damaging effects on the previous system. So yeah, but I'll think about that.
All kinds of badly constructed things.
Okay, just a comment on your quote on Hayek at the end of the ortho-liberal phrase, the long convoluted quote. I just wanted to show it. Well, if you want to get to it, but just the language, and then in your paper on page 16, you cite this as showing reverence towards Eucken and so on.
Which one?
This is the quote. It says, while it would be an exaggeration, it would not be altogether untrue.
Yes, I know. Yes, I know. Yeah.
And in fact, you in your paper, you have the first part where it's before it would not be altogether untrue. He says, while it would be an exaggeration, and then he says it would not be altogether untrue. My reaction is, with friends like that, who needs enemies? I mean, we're sort of damning with faint praise. I mean, if this is sort of Hayek's position on Ordo-Liberalism, I think it's obviously very hedged. I mean, if this is so I just want to make that observation.
Yes, yes, and it was part.
And you should really put in the other part. I think it's misleading right before the quote. So you should put in. You have it in the paper. While it would be, what you're omitting there in those 3 dots at the beginning is, while it would be an exaggeration. And I think that gives a very different complexion on.
Okay, I was not aware of that. I will reread the quote again. It was part long, so I probably.
Okay, so that was my second question. You meant this is really my first one was more of a comment. My question was, you mentioned about the translation of the Road to Serfdom into Germany. And I'm just curious what the reaction was in Germany to the translation, what the impact was, because I was going on the first session today about notions of freedom and so on in Eucken, but I'm wondering there's this issue about notions of freedom more generally in German society. Was there much of a notion of individual rights and individual freedom in German society? That point has been made. And so I'm wondering what the reception was to the Road to Serfdom in Germany when it was translated to Luther.
That is a complex story because it was banned by the Allies. Because that's true. That
answers your question. There was no reception.
It was true. No, that's not true. There was a reception, but concerning a broad impact on the public, that was certainly difficult because they said it's too critical of Russia, so there are allies, etc. However, Röpke's books were very influential. For example, on Ludwig Erhard, he was reading them. He was reading illegal. You could have really get into trouble if you read Röpke in the 1940s. However, there were many manuscripts and typed versions of the book, so these were available, and these were fairly inspiring to people like Ludwig Erhard. That is true. Concerning the Road to Serfdom, it circulated in this Reader's Digest version because American soldiers had that, manifold. But in the German translation was banned because it was too critical of Russia.
What was the part of the Reader's Digest?
Pardon?
That's of course some content.
The Reader's Digest is a condensed version. Yes, it's a very condensed version of the book.
I've got one other set of comments or questions regarding this sort of rules versus spontaneous part, I mean, this may be sort of an obvious point, but I think one of the issues of Hayek is doing a constructivist rules-based element in part to allow the spontaneous ecological part to occur. And that's sort of the entire issue. Should be, and I think sometimes that's confused, but that's sort of lost. That's what he's sort of trying to balance. So you want the rules in the Constitution to allow the ecological part to occur. And I think it's an AER article that Smith did, among other places where he makes this distinction. But I'm wondering, related to this, Murawski is making something about Hayek as sort of stressing markets as information processors, and this is the ecological element. And Murawski is even arguing in this sense, Hayek is somewhat postmodernist, because it implies a sort of diffuse state of knowledge and so on. But I'm wondering in this regard, going back to the Ordo-Liberals, what their position is on the role of markets as sort of information processors. Do they see that as an important role? Is there an ecological element to the Ordo-Liberal part?
Well, certainly, certainly the information problem does not play the role, I would say, in Eucken as it does in Hayek. Although in the principles which I showed before, the red book which you had, David, he quotes, I think, the use of knowledge in society. So he was aware of the particle, but it does not play the role. And this is, if you look at this German discourse on Ordo-Liberalism, this is one of the critiques concerning Ordo-Liberalism, that it's too little aware of the knowledge problem, saying that it's not really explicit on that, meaning that the rules come, where did it come from? So do we have the knowledge about that? Price system and competition are viewed in a different way. I tried to stress that out last year. Competition is not a discovery procedure of knowledge. That is certainly not the case. The core role of competition and of the market process, if in a well-designed framework for the Ordo-Liberals, is what I probably misconceived last year. I called it an emasculation process. So it was, competition is a procedure to destroy power, not to destroy knowledge. So Ordo-Liberals come very strongly from the power perspective, not having too much to say about knowledge, whereas I would say in Hayek it's the opposite. He says a lot about knowledge, but it's fairly seldom that he says something about power. He says in Law, Legislation and Liberty that we can get into a power problem, but only if groups unite interests. So we talked about that before. So I would say that the knowledge problem is not as prominent in Ordo-Liberalism as it is in Hayek.
It is, but the price mechanism is the steering mechanism, and therefore the steering mechanism is basically...
yes, of course it's a steering mechanism, but it's not seen from an informational perspective.
No, that's not, no, absolutely not, no. But it's not only the system to emasculate, to construct power, but especially to...
It's a coordination mechanism.
The coordination mechanism.
Which, yes, that's certainly true. And if you have good competition, and I was talking about as effective as possible, then you would also get, apart from the coordination part, you would get also the destruction of power issue, which would be seminal for them.
I'm going to call this session to a close and thank Stefan for a really good paper. Dean Hall and back here at 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock?
Yes. So shorter break today. Go ahead.